Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third class on this text by Lama Atisha, the Bodhisattvas, Jewel Garland. Let's go ahead and start. I do need to have the sharing on so I can share
Right.
the prayers. Um, Again, we're working with this text that is this wonderful kind of string of jewels, this little bits of advice that Lama Atisha is giving us in terms of particularly Bodhisattva practice. But we'll come to that in a moment. Let's go ahead and start. Again, I'm going to skip these first few prayers that I have in my file. We're just going to begin with taking refuge and generating bodhicitta. We'll recite this in English the first time. So we remind ourselves of what this prayer is saying, these two main thoughts of refuge and bodhicitta. And then we'll do it twice, chanting the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kapsuchi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi Dola penchir sangye duparsho sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chanyan gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye duparsho. All right, let's do a short meditation before we begin the class. Spend the first few minutes just doing a meditation on the breath, and you can choose whatever technique you prefer to use with the breath. But the goal of that is just to try to let go of whatever thoughts might be passing through our head from our day, whatever distractions we might have, bringing the awareness to the breath. And whenever the mind wanders, just keep returning to the breath. So we'll do this in silence for a few minutes, and then I will lead you in a short reflection to kind of refresh our motivation of bodhicitta for our time together. So we can begin the meditation now. Now let's set our motivation of bodhicitta. And I believe in the last class, we did briefly review the first technique for generating this mind. So we're just going to do a very brief review of the second technique and meditate on it as best as we can in this abbreviated way. This second technique is targeting this mind of self-centeredness, self-cherishing. It is an obstacle to our opening our hearts to the welfare of all beings because it's focused primarily on our own needs. So we first equalize ourselves and others. We recall that all beings are exactly the same as us in a very fundamental way. They simply want to be happy, don't want to suffer. And in spite of those wishes, they continue to suffer and continue to be thwarted in obtaining the happiness that they seek. So in this way, we see that our focus on our own needs and thinking our happiness and our freedom from suffering is more important than others is really not a valid thought. We want to at least see that we are equal to others. Their needs are the same as ours. So just briefly contemplate that reality. Seeing yourself and others as equal, at least, going to bring others to an even greater importance in this rest of this meditation, but at least to see the equality of self and others. So, in this technique of equalizing and exchanging self and others, the rest of this meditation is the exchange of self importance with the importance of other beings, learning to cherish them, to hold them dear. We do this first by reflecting on the fact that if we follow the self cherishing mind, it only brings about suffering, causes us to engage in unwholesome actions, to harm other beings, and it really doesn't bring about what we seek. Moreover, the mind of cherishing others does the opposite. It actually leads to the happiness that we seek. By tending to the needs of others, we can accomplish not just our temporal well being, but our ultimate well being. So the first steps are really to see the disadvantages of continuing to follow that self centeredness and the great benefit if we were to exchange self and others and to learn to cherish others as more dear than ourselves. Just briefly reflect on those 2 points to kind of feed into doing the actual exchange. So then we make that determination to exchange self and others, to learn to hold others as more dear than oneself. And we do this practice very briefly that we call Tonglen, taking and giving. We can first visualize that all beings are surrounding us. We're going to do this in a very general way in relation to all beings. We have our friends and dear ones of this life in the space to either side and immediately behind us. The difficult people in our lives in the space immediately in front of us. And then surrounding those two groups, the countless other beings that are strangers. And we can think of all these beings in a human form, these countless beings in the space around us. And we want to focus initially on their suffering, how they are dealing with dissatisfaction in some manner, perhaps pain, perhaps just the dissatisfaction that is a part of life, never really finding exactly what will bring them complete, lasting happiness and peace. And we generate the thoughts of compassion towards them, thinking how wonderful it would be if they were free of all suffering, all dissatisfaction. thinking, may they be free of this, really strengthening that. And then taking this kind of altruistic attitude, thinking, I will do this for them. I will free them from all suffering. And in particular, in this meditation, I will imagine taking on all of their suffering, taking it away from them so they need not experience it. I will gladly, willingly do this for them. And then we can visualize that our self-cherishing is at our heart in the form of a kind of thick, dark mass, like a huge rock, very heavy, very dense. And we turn our attention towards the beings around us and we begin to breathe in their suffering in the form of a thick, hot, dark smoke comes down to our heart center and it completely surrounds and envelops this mind of self-cherishing. Through our willingness to take on that suffering, it begins to diminish our mind of self-centeredness. So do this for just a short while, breathing in more and more of the suffering of the beings around you, their dissatisfaction, bringing it to your heart center and letting it eat away, diminish the mind of self-centeredness at your heart. And then eventually get to a place where you're removing the last bit of suffering, of dissatisfaction, again, what the Buddha called dukkha, removing the last bit of that from all sentient beings. So they are completely free of that. You bring it down to your heart center, breathing it in, willingly taking it on, and it annihilates the last bit of the self-cherishing mind, this rock of self-cherishing at your heart. And take a moment to pause and rejoice that you have done this for beings, freed them from suffering. And moreover, you have annihilated your self-cherishing mind through your willingness to take away their suffering. We see when we observe those beings that they haven't yet attained kind of fulfillment of their potential for true happiness and peace. They're free from suffering, but they have not yet attained the full bliss that is their birthright. So we begin to generate loving kindness towards them, begin to have the thoughts of how wonderful it would be if all of these beings, whether they're a friend, a difficult person, stranger, that all of them had happiness, the causes of happiness, both temporal and ultimate happiness. Strengthen that with the thought of, may they have these, may this truly come to pass. And then again, that altruistic intention that thinks, and I will do this for them. In particular, I will give away everything that I have that brings me happiness so that others can have the true peace and happiness that they seek. So then we engage in the practice of giving. This begins by visualizing that at our heart center, where the mind of self-cherishing was before, it's now gone, but at our heart center appears this amazing, multifaceted, crystal clear jewel, a wish-fulfilling jewel. We visualize that everything that we have that brings us happiness and well-being, all the resources we possess, our body even, our friends, everything that is in our lives now, as well as all of our karma, our merit, all the positive potential that is the cause of all of these things. All of that transforms into brilliant light that enters into this jewel at our heart. making it radiant, brilliant, filled with light. And then we begin to send it out with the out breath. It exits from us, goes to the beings around us, and it becomes instantly what they need, initially for their temporal well being, but eventually bringing them the causes that will lead to their ultimate well being, such as teachers and Dharma books and everything that will support the development of their minds on the path to full awakening, to the bliss of Buddhahood. So imagine doing that for the next half minute or so, just sending out more and more of this brilliant light at your own heart center from that jewel. And it becomes the cause for advancing the happiness and well being of all the beings surrounding you, bit by bit, giving more and more of it away, bringing them closer and closer to the complete state of bliss, Buddhahood. And we get to a place where we're going to give the last bit of our happiness, our well being away, that last bit of brilliant light that's in the jewel at our heart. And it becomes the final cause for all the beings around us, without exception, to attain their ultimate welfare, the complete bliss of Buddhahood. Visualize doing that now, sending that out to all of these beings in that state. And then it's before we can rejoice that we have done this for these beings. We have happily, willingly given away all of our happiness so others can attain that state, developing this deeper courage that is involved in cherishing others to that degree. And then we recognize that although we have done this in our own imagination, our visualization, we have not made this reality. We have to be willing to take this task on ourselves, to bring all sentient beings to their perfect state, free from all suffering, attaining all happiness and well being. And to do that, we have to become a Buddha ourselves. We arrive at that mind of bodhicitta that is the jewel at our heart, that is that mind that we take with us continually, that adorns us in the way that all of these pieces of advice adorn the Bodhisattva. And we bring that mind deeply into our hearts right now so that everything we do tonight together becomes the cause for actualizing that result, our own enlightenment and the enlightenment of all beings that we will then be dedicated to accomplishing. And you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. Thank you for bearing with a little bit longer motivation tonight with that. Again, I just wanted to spend a little time reviewing those techniques. I didn't talk about them so much in the first class, but at least have some brief meditation on them. Again, there's much advice on practicing those, particularly in the Lam Rim texts, whatever text that you happen to pick up, no doubt has a fair amount on developing bodhicitta. So in the last class, we made it up through the first two lines of verse 7 of this text. And that, remember, we included in that a few of the verses at the end. And we pull that back on the screen. That's here. Hopefully I have it big enough. I actually realize that you can make it so that it's covering more of the screen. So if it needs to be bigger, I can certainly do that, but hopefully that's good enough for tonight. Verse 7 started with these first two lines: forsake material possessions. In other words, don't get so caught up in all of these things that we can own and possess. Instead, embellish yourself with the wealth of the noble ones. Remember, we looked at these seven jewels or seven gems of the Arya beings. These are a way that we can adorn ourselves as well on this Bodhisattva path through engaging in the practices that lead to attainment of enlightenment and so on. Again, I won't go through those again. They were in verses 25 and 26, but we'll see them come back when we get to that level or that part of the text. But we won't go into them again because we've already covered them through talking about them last week. The rest of verse 7 has this advice: avoid all trifling distractions and reside in the solitude of wilderness. So we have kind of two ideas here, but they're very much interrelated. Trifling distractions, or kind of these trivial things that we can get involved in. I think Alex Berzin calls them bustling activities, frivolities. The idea is that there are a lot of things that can draw us away from our spiritual path. We want to avoid those things and not be taken up by them, because this is what we've been involved in since beginningless time in samsara, and it has not led to any great peace or satisfaction. It's only been a distraction for us to actually work on our minds. And then that last part of it, reside in the solitude of wilderness. The idea there is that, of course, if we're going to really develop our minds, it does require some degree of solitude. Most of you have studied all of the techniques for particularly generating a very focused mind, the mind that we call calm abiding, or shamatha in the Sanskrit. This is a very important stage in our mental development. We do have to have a very concentrated, focused mind that is single pointedly able to analyze and work with the teachings so that we can change our minds. Right now, our minds are very flighty and distracted. And so, if we don't have that concentration, we're going to be only on those objects for a brief period of time while we're doing our meditation. Our meditation is not going to be so powerful. So, we really do have to gain some strength of mind. And that is generally done in solitude, as are a lot of the deeper advances that we can make on the spiritual path. It's not to say that one's life should be entirely in solitude. Certainly, bodhisattvas are about being active in the world, being interacting with other beings, practicing the other perfections. Remember, we have the 6 perfections of a bodhisattva. Many of them are engaged in relation to others, such as generosity, morality, patience. Joyous effort has kind of both elements of our own practice as well as how we are engaging with others. It's the 5th one of concentration that we really need to have some solitude to develop at a deeper level. Yes, you can do your meditation as part of your daily practice and continue to be active in the world, but to really take it to a much deeper level does require some degree of solitude. And then, of course, to generate the 6th perfection, the perfection of wisdom, does require that stable support of a single pointed mind in order to realize that to an even greater degree. So, in order for the bodhisattva to make progress in developing any of the realizations of the path, bodhicitta in particular, which again we've seen as one of the main topics in this text, uh, we have to have that stability of mind. We have to be able to really transform our minds. And that is only done through deeper concentration. Concentration is a tool, it's not a final result in and of itself. But without that tool, we really can't make much progress. So again, solitude, it is referring here to that isolating oneself from the world to a large degree. There are many retreat centers that focus on creating the ideal conditions for doing that. I'm not going to go into a whole discussion of that. That's also set out in the Lam Rim text. There are a number of conditions that are really ideal to have in order to create the right environment for this all to occur and develop. I might mention one thing, though, that Lama Zopa Rinpoche emphasized. I think this was in the last set of teachings that I had from him in 2017 down in North Carolina at the Light of the Path retreats, where he said, it doesn't mean, though, that you just kind of get yourself geared up to go into this sort of perfect, ideal situation and then you're able to accomplish meditation like that. He says it requires also merit. Merit is that other part of our path that is really so essential. It's like putting the gas in the tank to be able to get you to the destination. If you don't have that meritorious activity through engaging in preliminary practices and all the other things that support your attainment of realizations, and it's impossible to get there. So just keep that in mind as well. It's nice to have that aspiration of, may I be able to, at some point in this life, have the time and the energy and what have you to be able to go into a more secluded space of solitude and develop deeper concentration. But recognize that that does require getting things in line sort of mentally for that to happen through having the requisite merit that will allow you to attain that state. So I think I have a couple slides to share on this from some comments from some of the commentaries on this. Um, this is a this is, yeah, 7CD, kind of avoiding all trivial distractions and kind of leaving, behind all the things that normally we get caught up in. So I'm just sharing two verses that come from a wonderful text in the Tibetan tradition that followed from Atisha. Again, recall that he was the initiator of this whole Kadampa lineage. Tokme Sangpo wasn't a Kadampa master per se, but he's definitely in the same category. He has his wonderful text, The 37 Practices of Bodhisattvas. And in verse 2 and 3, these two verses that I'll share with you, it talks about that idea of how we kind of need to leave behind our normal, trivial distractions, the things that we get caught up in, and really dedicate ourselves to practice. So this verse 2 says, attached to your loved ones, you're stirred up like water. That's the first poison of attachment, right? Hating your enemies, you burn like fire. That's the second poison of anger, hatred. And then the third, ignorance. In the darkness of confusion, you forget what to adopt and discard. So if we're continually bound up by those three delusions, those three poisons that play out in terms of our everyday life, we have to give that up. It says there, give up your homeland, which is kind of that place of comfort and security that we like to be in to some degree, but is not profitable for us in the long term if we just continue to get involved in those distractions. And he concludes with, this is the practice of bodhisattvas, to give up their homeland, to give up that place of comfort and security and what have you, to go to a place of deeper work. Then in verse 3, by avoiding bad objects, disturbing emotions gradually decrease. Without distraction, virtuous activities naturally increase. That's the benefit of being in that space where we are focused on our minds and can do that deeper work, is that we won't be caught up in those disturbing patterns. We will be caught up, and we will be practicing virtuous activities. Third line, with clarity of mind, conviction in the teaching arises. We gain greater realization and understanding of the teachings when we're able to practice in seclusion. So cultivate seclusion, he says. This is the practice of bodhisattvas. If you've never studied this text, it's a wonderful text, these 37 verses of advice. But these first two really get at the heart of so much of our practice, that we really do have to have that dedication at some point, hopefully in this life, if not make aspiration for future lives, to be able to make a much more serious concerted effort at achieving realizations. It can be done to some degree in our everyday life while we are working and doing other things, but it's so much harder because the mind is caught up in those patterns of distraction. I might mention that at one teaching I went to, perhaps even some of you were there in Bloomington, Indiana in 1999 when His Holiness taught before the Kalachakra initiation. He taught on chapter 8 of Shantideva's text. And in that chapter, um, there's a lot of good advice around meditation. That's the title of that chapter. And one of the questions he got from the audience was from a woman whose husband was talking about going off and doing this. And she was concerned because, she needed him to be at home. They had children they were raising, all this other kind of stuff. And she goes, is this the sort of advice that's given for people to just go off and, seclude themselves from the world and, 3-4 years or whatever it takes to generate all these realizations and what have you? And His Holiness made it very clear that, no, our first priority is to the people who are in our lives. And there are those very, very few who actually can be dedicated to that level of practice and have the ability to do that. So it was kind of reassuring. I mean, it doesn't mean that you have to follow exactly like what Prince Siddhartha did of leaving his family behind on this quest for moksha, for liberation or whatever. That is the rare case of somebody who will actually be profitable in doing that. Somebody could do that with who knows what kind of misguided meditation or not really or misguided motivation or not be really be ready for that level of practice, and then they've left their family high and dry, and they've ruined their spiritual practice. So that is not something that we should hear this advice and think, oh, I need to close up all of my work and everything I do, head for the caves in the mountains, and just meditate the rest of my life. Again, that's the rare person that really has the karma and the ability to do that. So don't think that that is something that this verse is calling you to do necessarily. Maybe there are, again, those few that would benefit from that type of practice, but for most of us, probably not. We might end up even going astray somewhat on our path. I do like these few little quotes that are from Geshe Ngawang Dargye. I'm sharing some of them throughout this from his book, The Advice from a Spiritual Friend. A great meditator once said, this is him quoting this great meditator, whoever this was, as a beginner, I find this life in the mountains enjoyable. Birds and animals come to visit me, and I can freely talk with them without it giving rise to anger, attachment, and a host of other delusions. It probably is easier to deal with birds and animals in the mountains or whatever than it is to deal with the people that we have in our everyday life on the streets of the city and wherever it is that we are going. And then I wanted to share a little bit from this, again, newer commentary by Lama Gyurme. Furthermore, the more you spend time alone in seclusion, the more you come to appreciate and understand yourself. And even if you are surrounded by a crowd, because again, you're probably not going to spend your whole life in a cave, learning to be alone will actually make you more at peace as you grow older. The more you become peaceful, even in old age, you won't feel lonely. It's impossible. I like this advice because so many of us have this fear of being alone and the loneliness that seems to come with that. But it's all up to our minds. If we have developed our minds to be comfortable in seclusion, in solitude, then we will be fine being with others or not being with others. He says, however, individuals who spend most of their youth in the company of others and in crowded environments will struggle with feelings of depression and loneliness later in life. Why? Because they never took the time to be alone and enjoy their own company. Their minds become addicted to the crowd, so when they finally find themselves alone, they begin to feel lonely, especially in old age when they can no longer attend parties or visit friends. They are left feeling lonely in their empty homes. So again, he's just pointing out, the fact that there is some benefit even just to the habit of being in solitude. And even if you can't do longer meditation periods in this life, it's good to at least say, okay, I'm going to take a week or whatever it is you can afford and go to some place that supports that type of practice where you can have that time in solitude. You can train yourself to be with your own mind, to be in isolation from others, and see what comes up for you and work on your mind. How wonderful. What a gift to give to yourself. So, again, most practitioners try to find some time within each year to at least have some sort of a retreat. But it's really, again, that important practice for a variety of reasons, as we've seen in looking at that two lines. So I'm spending a little more on that one. We won't spend quite as much time on all of these, obviously. Let's go to verse 8. It has once more kind of two thoughts to it, so I'm going to divide it into two parts. The first two lines, abandon frivolous words, constantly guard your speech. We did see some things about speech earlier on, right? That we do need to have some kind of attention to how we are talking with others and not being critical of them and whatever. We guarding our speech, making sure that we are able to kind of not harm others with our speech is really important. But that first one, abandon frivolous words, that's really talking about one of the patterns of speech that we get involved in when we aren't very careful, when we aren't really guarding and tending our speech, which is the tendency to engage in a lot of meaningless talk. This is something that draws us in all around, right? Just love to talk to people about various things, and especially with everything going on in our country and the politics and all this other, it just seems like that's a natural part of our lives, is go to a cafe or something and sit down with a friend and just talk for hours about things that are really not that meaningful. Now, you can talk about many of those things and make them more meaningful, and not every moment of our lives in conversation with others has to be meaningful, because obviously we're social beings and we need that way of connecting. We can't just immediately see somebody and say, oh, let's talk about Dharma and keep the conversation only on meaningful things. That's really impossible to do. But we do have to be careful because this is how we really diminish the power of our practice, is that we engage in things that are really not supporting what we are trying to accomplish, to have more attention to our speech. I remember there was a wonderful teaching by a Vipassana teacher, Eric Kolvig, where he was teaching on the Eightfold Path, the Noble Eightfold Path. And one of those, of course, is right speech. And his guideline for speaking is that we should have two thoughts for anything that we say. One, what am I going to say? I mean, really think about the content of the words that you are about to utter out of your mouth before you say them, which of course we tend not to do anyway. We just immediately start saying whatever comes to mind. But two, why am I saying it? Really look at our deeper motivation. Is it to impress others and make them like us? Is it to, feed into the anger or frustration that the other person is feeling and commiserate with them? Is it, driven by a deeper purpose, by wanting to express our compassion and our concern for others and their suffering? So we have to really look at what are we saying? Why are we saying it? And then we'll probably avoid a lot of this meaningless talk. We will make sure that what we say has some purpose and is really well thought out, that it is words that have some meaning, substance to them, so that we actually do have a healthier way of going about communicating with others. There's another quote that Geshe Ngawang Dargye had from the junior tutor to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the late Trijang Rinpoche. His reincarnation is, I think, in Switzerland now, a little distant from His Holiness, but nonetheless, when Trijang Rinpoche was his junior tutor, he said, if you find your mind in a state not conducive to performing virtuous actions, do not go and talk idly with someone. Instead, go to sleep. You might not accumulate much virtue, but at least you will not accumulate non-virtue. I mean, he's giving us that advice of like, there may be times where, it's really wise to just go to sleep instead of being out there. Like you might be kind of, I can't really meditate. I can't do anything else. Well, I'm just going to go down to the cafe and talk to people. And then you end up getting caught up in a lot of meaningless chatter. Maybe it might be better to just pull the covers over your head and get some rest. You won't get much virtue, but at least you won't accumulate non-virtue. And then he quotes Patrul Rinpoche, the great Nyingma Dzogchen master, composer of a wonderful sort of stages of the path text called The Words of My Perfect Teacher. He says, now that I am ready to go into retreat, I shall stop talking altogether. I shall cease sending my mind out to seek the faults in others, and instead I shall spend my time looking within. Life is too short to waste in mental wandering and limitless gossip. So again, these great masters of the past have embraced this idea of at least controlling our speech and being mindful of what we are doing with our speech, if not outright, you know, refraining from talking. That's why, again, most longer retreats and what have you, we want to do in silence, even shorter ones if we can. And then there's some wonderful quote from Master Shantideva, again, The Way of the Bodhisattva, his 5th chapter. He says, if by chance you must take part in lengthy conversations worthlessly, or if you come upon sensational events, then cast aside delight and taste for them. So if we do have to be in those situations where we're talking with others, try to refrain from that kind of delight and attachment to that. It is very easy to get caught up in those patterns of just the delight of conversing at all hours. I remember I used to do that in college. Maybe there was some substances involved in that as well, but be up till like 3 or 4 in the morning having these what seemed like meaningful talks, but in retrospect, they really were not so meaningful at all. And then Pema Chodron, in commenting on that verse, she says, moreover, Shantideva says, we can waste a lot of time distracting ourselves with mindless chatter. And she was reminded of the time she lived in Taos. There was a Native American man, she says, from the Taos Pueblo called Little Joe Gomez. In the early 70s, he met some people who were practicing complete silence. They were wearing chalkboards around their necks in case they did need to communicate. This got Little Joe laughing. When someone asked him what was so funny, he said, it's very easy to not talk, very difficult to talk mindfully. As far as he was concerned, the better practice was to converse consciously, to really have some mindfulness to what we are doing. There's some truth to that. So you get different perspectives. Patrul Rinpoche saying, just zip your lip, shut up, don't say anything, isolate yourself. And then, there is some wisdom to saying that in some ways is easy because I don't have the temptation of saying anything because I'm not engaged in conversation. It's really important that if we are going to be with others and do have conversation with them, that we do so consciously, mindfully. We try to have some awareness of what we are doing. And again, that can be through those steps that I mentioned from Eric Kolvik. What am I saying? Why am I saying it? And not always possible to slow ourselves down to be able to get that in there, but nonetheless, little bits of advice that perhaps will help. Then the last two lines I'm not going to talk much about when you see your teachers and preceptors. Again, preceptors, according to that footnote, again, these are the ones who have given us vows, particularly the lay vows or the other pratimoksha vows, where they're called individual liberation vows. If you've ordained as a monk or a nun, then you would have deeper levels of pratimoksha vows. But any of the vows, actually, bodhisattva vows, tantric vows would also be included in it. When you ever see anybody who's played that role for you as a teacher or a preceptor, reverently generate the wish to serve. And I don't, again, that's a huge topic in Tibetan Buddhism, particularly in Vajrayana and the Tantric teachings, the importance of our spiritual guides, of our teachers and our preceptors, those who are playing a role in terms of our spiritual development. And ideally, we want to hold them with great reverence because we see that the role that they are playing for us is extraordinary. It's something that is going to be able to help us in immeasurable ways. So again, there is that all the teachings that are given generally at the very beginning of the Lam Rim. It's one of the first meditation topics. The first meditation topic really is reliance upon a spiritual master, a spiritual mentor, and the thoughts that go with that. And of course, one of them involves our actions, where we should want to uh, offer our service to them, to be a benefit to them. And of course, for some of them, it might be, you know, things that they need in terms of transportation or, being helping to transcribe their teachings or whatever the case might be. You all have the wonderful, Kandala coming there very soon. You can offer service in terms of allowing her to get where she needs to go and do what she needs to do in New York and making sure, she's well taken care of. Those sorts of things are really important. They're ways of setting aside our own ego and our own, desire to take care of ourselves and really attend to beings who are in a role where they're playing some um, kind of major part in our spiritual development, helping us to a greater degree. Again, there's a whole set of teachings on who are our teachers and spiritual masters, what are the qualities that we want in those, what's the process by which we get into that relationship with a spiritual teacher and see them in that light. But I'm not going to go into all of that. It's just an important part of our practice in the Mahayana is really to respect our teachers. And I think it's even within the other traditions of Tibetan Buddhism or of Buddhism to really admire and honor those who are playing a role in terms of teaching us, particularly when they're at a very high level and have already kind of developed deep skills and understanding themselves, that we want to see them in that light. So again, I'm not going to say too much more about that because I think that particular part of that verse is pretty straightforward. In regard to this, there's kind of two parts to this as well. This is 5 lines in this verse. The first part of 9 is the first 3 lines. It says, toward wise beings with Dharma eyes, which mean those beings who have developed deeper wisdom and understanding of the Dharma, maybe again, like our teachers that were mentioned in the previous verse, but even other practitioners who have that wisdom. And secondly, toward being beginners on the path as well. Recognize them both essentially as your spiritual teachers. You know? Now, this is kind of an interesting one because, we look at it and we tend to think that, oh, well, the teachers are those who have that extra Dharma knowledge, who are wise in terms of their understanding of the Dharma, their ability to have practiced it and give us good advice on all of that. Well, of course, they are obviously our spiritual teachers because of the wisdom, the qualities that they hold. But it's interesting that he points out that even beginners on the path can be our teachers. In the Zen tradition, we have this idea that there was even a book, I think, by D.T. Suzuki called "A Beginner's Mind," or something. Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. I think that's the name of the book. The idea is there's something that happens when we kind of go back to that place of observing beginners, or even trying to recall in our own minds the spirit of approaching the Dharma anew with those sort of fresh eyes that happen when people come from that perspective. I had the good fortune of leading a week-long retreat at Vajrapani Institute in Boulder Creek, California in March. And it was mostly beginners. And it was really quite refreshing, to be in the presence of people who had just beginning to open their eyes of Dharma, beginning to see the value of these teachings. There's something really precious about that, because it reminds us of that sort of spirit that we want to be able to bring to the teachings all the time, to not sort of rest on our laurels and think, oh, we know it all and we've had all these teachings, and it becomes a little disempowering if we think about the teachings that way. We get really inspired when we hang around with beginners and we see what we can learn from them. I often find too that when I teach beginners, I get questions that I wouldn't get from people who've studied for a while, perhaps. That just happens. So beginners come in with much more curiosity and not taking everything that is said through the lens of having heard other teachings that support it. They want to understand it right from the ground up. So there's a lot that we can learn from beginners. And of course, I think we can learn from anyone in that whole range, from, people who are very wise with their wisdom, eyes open in terms of the Dharma, as well as those who are brand new on the path, everyone in between. Everyone has something to teach us. This is actually a wonderful way to go about living one's life. Anyone we encounter, anything they're doing, can we see it as a lesson? Can we see it as something that is actually teaching us? And even if it's really just at the very basic level of, if we're seeing others who are engaged in things that we kind of bristle at, we go, oh my gosh, look at what they're doing. Well, that can be seen as a lesson for us to avoid those sorts of things and to try to develop our minds to be able to help others who are engaged in such negative behavior. So again, there's lots that we can learn from others. By no means should we see that it's only those people who have great wisdom that we can learn from. Um, Now, again, I will point out that in the book by Lama Gyurme that I quoted from a little bit earlier, there is a slightly different translation. It says those who possess enlightened vision, which isn't a huge difference, wisdom eye or whatever compared to that, and those first setting up out upon the path, regard them both as Buddha. It's kind of interesting. Again, I was just talking about spiritual teachers, and of course, in the Lam Rim, there is that concept of seeing our spiritual teachers as Buddhas. And of course, we can also do that with regard to all beings, because all beings have Buddha nature, they have Buddha potential. However, probably most beings are not Buddhas yet. However, our spiritual teachers, maybe there's a better chance that they're Buddhas. I mean, if we really look at this whole idea, we are dedicating ourselves continually through studying this text, through our engaging in practice of the Mahayana, to attaining the goal of Buddhahood, to developing our minds so we can become a Buddha with the primary aim of benefiting all beings. But we have to answer that question. How will we do that? When you achieve that state of Buddhahood, how are Buddhas actually helping sentient beings now? And how would we be then helping them when we attain that state? It makes sense that the way that being Buddhas are helping others is through this role of spiritual teacher, spiritual guide, spiritual mentor, the gurus, because that is the most central thing in our spiritual development, to have beings who are leading us on that path, who can speak from their experience how to work with our minds and how to develop the qualities that they possess. So this is an important part of that logic behind that. It's not to say that we should instantly think that everyone, in that role is perfect and is a Buddha and what have you. We have to check up and really get some faith that the beings we're being led by have the qualities that we're seeking. But nonetheless, once we develop that type of relationship, particularly on the tantric path, again in Vajrayana, becomes especially important that we hold that view because of what transpires in tantric initiation and so on. We want to hold the view that that is a fully enlightened being who is manifesting in this form for us. Again, that does complete the circuit then. When we become a Buddha, we'll be able to do that for others by appearing in that form. Because Buddhas aren't beings that have checked out of all this and they're hanging out in the Buddha bar with other Buddhas. I mean, they're beings who are continually involved in the welfare of others. That's what the motivation of bodhicitta is about. We want to have that as our driving force. We want to be dedicated to helping all beings, and we attain Buddhahood so we can do that. So, how do we do that? By manifesting in forms, in particular, by manifesting as teachers. Because as teachers, we then can give the Dharma purely, perfectly, in accord with the needs of all those that we meet. So that's the idea behind this is in Lama Gyurme's translation, he's saying, seeing, regarding them both as Buddha. I will share a little bit about what he says on that that gives his clarification on it. He says the mindset of treating all beings as Buddhas, and I inserted in there, or spiritual teachers, can be applied in various situations. For example, when encountering someone less fortunate, we can see them as a Buddha who has come to teach us the importance of compassion and generosity. Right. So when you're walking on the streets and you see someone who's in a very unfortunate situation, doesn't have a home, doesn't have all the resources that we have, we can see them as someone who's teaching us how we need to be compassionate, caring, generous with what we have. When faced with someone who is unkind or speaks harshly, we must not respond harshly, but rather we should show them respect. We can view them as a Buddha who is testing our patience. In everyone we meet, I mentioned this a short while ago, we can see as a teacher. He's using the idea of even seeing them as a Buddha, because we don't know who is a Buddha, who isn't a Buddha. We think that we may have an understanding of it, but we could be very wrong. Could be Buddhas who are walking the streets of New York City, who are having this manifestation of being in dire poverty, but they are trying to be there as guides for us. In any case, he says, the way you treat them now is with equality and respect. Understood? This is the essence of the idea. Consider them both as your spiritual guides or as Buddhas. The great Indian master Shantideva, again, instructs us to regard even ordinary beings as Buddhas. And again, this is on the basis of the fact that they have Buddha nature, the potential to achieve that state. And we also do not know. We could be very wrong in terms of that appearance of them as an ordinary being, could be faulty, could be a false appearance. Again, we cannot trust all of these things that we see necessarily. So he concludes, whether we encounter those who possess the eye of wisdom and enlightened vision, or conversely, those who are just starting out on their spiritual journey, let us treat them with the same reverence we would show a Buddha. Let us respect and honor all beings, for it is through this mindset that we can cultivate humility and truly embody the teachings of Buddhism. So I liked his advice because, again, I think it's really, it's hard practice, absolutely, to be able to see others in that through that lens of like this is a being I need to cherish and revere and have some real, kind of warm feelings towards, because not everybody's manifesting in a warm, fuzzy way to us, right? So this is a practice to continually entertain that thought, to look at others through that lens of someone who can teach us, who can guide us in the ways that were demonstrated, through Lama Gyurme's commentary, but also at a deeper level, we really don't know who others are. I even joke sometimes that all the people I teach, maybe they're all Buddhas and they're all just helping me to get there, through manifesting as students, and I mean, maybe it sounds a little egocentric, but the reality is that's going to happen at some point. There's going to be the last Bodhisattva, the one who is kind of needing to be taken to that state. And because there won't be any other sentient beings, the Buddhas will maybe appear as ordinary beings in order to help that Bodhisattva advance. Again, I don't think I'm that one, but I'm just saying maybe somebody can write that novel, The Last Bodhisattva. But the idea is that we really don't know. Everything is appearance to us. It's a karmic appearance according to our own karma. And that's, of course, why we have this concept of Buddhas attaining that state, appearing in an ordinary form, appearing in the form of, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who was born like us and grew up like us and has a body that ages like us and gets ill like us, is because that's the ordinary appearance that we have. And especially again with people like His Holiness, who are great revered lamas that are in this role. Kandrala, again, who's coming there shortly later this month. All of these beings we can see as that possibility that they are a fully enlightened being appearing in that form. But once more, Atisha is giving us the advice of, can we look at all beings in that way? Can we see the variety of ways that they can be teachers for us, or that we can hold that kind of really dear um, essence that is their true nature at the core of their being, that Buddha nature that is really speaking to who they are at the deeper level, whether they've attained that state or not, we can still have that reverence. Yeah. So maybe that's enough about that. But I like how Master Shantideva throws in some things that, yeah, have a lot of different dimensions to them, perhaps. The last two lines of verse 9, D and E, he says, in fact, when you see any sentient being, view them as your parent, your child, or your grandchild. Again, when I went through briefly that first technique of developing bodhicitta, the sevenfold cause and effect, where we recognize that every being has been our mother. And then we have that kind of view of them as someone who has been very kind to us. When you generate the love and compassion for them, it is often said in the text that you kind of think about now they're your child, and it's as if you're the mother, you're the parent, or the one who is now looking upon others with true affection in the same way that you would to any being who, is very dear or close to you. And that's kind of the attitude. We see that beings have been very kind to us, and then we generate the mind that wishes to enact kindness for them, to help them to accomplish their welfare. This is, of course, not just those beings who are already in that circle of closeness, but especially the strangers and those difficult ones that we look at and we go, can I hold that view that this is actually someone very, very dear to me? And I would like to ideally attend to their welfare because of seeing them in that way. It's a deeper practice. Again, something that's not easy to come by. But if we actually work with that day in and day out to try to see others through that lens, yes, they are our spiritual teachers, can give us lots that we can work with. And also, we want to be attending to their needs as best as we can in the same way that we would to our grandchild or to our grandmother or parent, whatever the case might be. Not hold that distinction because they're not in that form in this life, that then suddenly they're exempt from that. No, we should have that same level of concern, especially if we do go back to that understanding that every one of those beings has been in those roles for us at one time or another, because we've had countless lifetimes since beginningless time. So again, that one I don't need to say too much more on, I think, either. It's relatively clear in terms of the idea of being able to hold others as very dear, have that thought of uh, cherishing them as someone very close to us. Then we go on to verse 10ab. I didn't think I had anything there. Let me go back to the text then. 10ab, the first two lines of this verse. Let me pull that up a little bit further. Renounce negative friendships and rely on a spiritual friend. So we're getting once more this idea of a spiritual friend being a very key, important part of our lives. And moreover, the first thought to really be careful in the types of people we surround ourselves with that can influence us in a negative or unwholesome way. We're very much social creatures. Most people have a proclivity towards being with others, having friends, groups of people that they can be with that support them to some degree and have some camaraderie with. But we have to be careful because those beings do have an influence on us. They say that one of the factors that leads to the arisal of the delusions is the influence of what we call misleading friends, people who will take us in a wrong direction. I mean, perhaps some of us, in looking at our lives going back to when we were quite young and, were influenced by people, perhaps we did a lot of things that we now have some regret in terms of behavior that we engaged in. That was really a product of being in that group and having the peer pressure and all the other things that feed into that. And of course, that happens even in our adult life where we often are hanging out with others and they're leading us to engage in behavior that's perhaps not so beneficial. Especially at the beginning of our path, it's very careful. We have to be very careful to not be under the influence of too much of that. One thing I might say is that this doesn't mean that then you have to like go through and your Facebook account and delete all the friends who are, in that category, get them out of my life. You don't want to kind of go to that extreme, but you do have to be somewhat attentive to that and recognize that be careful about who you do hang around with. If you've got the strength of mind to be with them and not be influenced by them, then that's perfectly fine, right? You can be with them and practice learning from them, seeing them as your teacher, having compassion for them, seeing them as your dear mother or child or grandchild or whatever. You can do lots of things in relation to these beings, but just be careful, particularly not to kind of come under their guidance, under their influence. So I'm going to share just a few quotes on that. There's this weird, I call it weird little text. It's a very short little text that Lama Zopa Rinpoche translated by this Acho Rinpoche. I don't really know who this Acho Rinpoche was, but it says, the quote that he has in there, it's kind of a strange little quote, but I'm sharing it anyway. There's no difference between male and female as evil friends of negative karma who make you lose this and all future lives. Through their influence, you engage in behavior that causes you to not get a good rebirth and maybe even have more misery in this life. Therefore, he says, throw them far away like a stone used for cleaning your bottom. It's kind of a weird visual, but apparently, I mean, they didn't have toilet paper in Tibet. And so they might use a stone that's, on the side of a river or whatever to clean their bottom and perhaps pitch the stone into the water. Who knows what they did with it? But the idea, sometimes we use the phrase like use toilet paper, right? Once that sort of used toilet paper, then you sort of discard it. You move away from it. This sounds rather extreme, but nonetheless, we do have to kind of do this mentally at least to say, I am not going to be in the same sort of close relationship with these. Again, it's used, the term here is used, evil friends. I'm not sure why Rinpoche translated that, but it's like they are friends who can take us on the wrong path. So we want to have this idea of having them more distant from us, if not physically, at least mentally, that we're not under their influence. The virtuous friend and virtuous companion, though, is the originator of qualities. Therefore, correctly devote and dedicate yourself. And so again, my own experience around this is that I didn't need to discard these people again, block them on Facebook, or stop answering their calls and have nothing to do with them. My own experience of meeting the Dharma over 30 years ago was that as I moved more and more on this path, those who were not in line with it sort of fell by the wayside. Just the energy wasn't there to kind of keep moving because we weren't going in the same direction. Start heading in a Dharma direction, other people going in their own worldly direction in terms of the things they like and they engage in. It just sort of naturally happens. There might be some times where we do need to be a little more forceful and we just say, I really need to do my meditation tonight. I can't go out to the bar or the cafe or whatever and do all these things. Where we recognize that we're only going to get into a situation where we're commiserating with that person in ways that are not beneficial and saying things that we're going to regret and, talking about other people and whatever the case might be. We just have to maybe make some decisions at times and say, I'm moving in this direction and really wanting to support my spiritual path. And I can't hang out with you anymore because I need that time for that. But really, never letting that person be kind of exempt from our heart. We still have compassion and concern for them. But we just recognize that we're on two different trajectories and I have to make that decision. But my own experience was that people just naturally tended to go off on their own because I wasn't there with them. I wasn't doing all the things that I used to do with them. And that's okay. So again, just understand that this isn't meant to be really like absolutely I have to sever all these relationships with people who are not supporting my spirituality, but rather find the more skillful way to be less under their influence, and then of course eventually to perhaps not have them in our lives in the ways that they would be able to kind of take us astray. Then from this text I mentioned earlier by Pato Rinpoche, The Words of My Perfect Teacher, there's a nice little quote that I think is really quite sweet. It says, ordinary people like us are, for the most part, easily influenced by the people and circumstances around us. That is why we should always follow a spiritual friend, and of course not follow those who are in that previous category, those who lead us on a negative path. And then he uses this beautiful example in the sandalwood forests of the Malaya Mountains. When an ordinary tree falls, meaning one that isn't sandalwood, its wood is gradually impregnated with the sweet perfume of the sandal. After some years, that ordinary wood comes to smell as sweet as the sandal trees around it. just by being near it, right? That ordinary tree falling in the neighborhood of those sandal trees, it becomes impregnated with that sweet smell. In just the same way, if you live and study with a perfect teacher full of good qualities, you will be permeated by the perfume of those qualities. And in everything you do, you will come to resemble them. I've often heard this idea of resembling them. They often say, be careful who you choose as a teacher because you're going to become just like them. So there is that idea that we do become more like the teachers by hanging around them, being in their presence, going to their teachings, receiving their guidance, consulting with them as we need to. That is how we actually, make some good development in terms of moving in the direction that they have already moved. They are guiding us on that path and helping us to have that sort of sweet smell of good morality and good behavior and what have you. So this is the importance of that particular verse is really to understand that it's a choice we can make. Certainly, do we hang out with the people who are going to take us on another path, or do we find greater support by going to teachers and even Sangha, community that can support us on our spiritual development? We're going to have much better luck on our spiritual path if we surround ourselves with those folks, because they are going to help us and not hinder our path. So let's go back to the next part of verse 10, the last two lines. It says there, dispel hostility and unpleasantness and venture forth to where happiness lies. There's kind of a different translation of this I'm going to share in a moment about venture forth to where happiness lies. I think what I'll share on the screen is Alex's translation, Alex Berzin, where he says, and happily go everywhere. The idea is first in this line, dispel hostility and unpleasantness. These are obviously, once more, ways that we can be in the world. We can kind of live our lives with a lot of hostility towards others, a lot of resentment, spite, whatever that we just plays out day in and day out with everyone that we meet, and we become kind of an unpleasant character. We all, maybe we've been like that. I hope none of you are still like that. I doubt it, but we certainly know people like that who are sort of like the embodiment of this negativity just kind of going around and really having an unfavorable impact on others, and in the process really ruining their own lives because they're living in that place of that kind of negativity. So this is obviously something that as Bodhisattva wannabes, or wherever we're at in our own path, we want to be very aware of, is that we don't get caught up in those patterns of sort of unpleasantness, hostility, malice, ill will, whatever. It can happen a lot. I mean, I look at, again, I do want to correlate things to our current world that we're living in, particularly in this country. We do have a lot of that going around, right? Where people are just they're very bitter and very frustrated at whatever is going on. And whatever side of the political fence is, you can probably find people that are in that category on both sides, certainly, or even beyond those two sides. This is the nature of the world that we live in, that there's a lot that people are getting quite angry and upset on. I was reading, didn't get around to reading all of it. There's an opinion piece in the New York Times, and it has a whole interview that goes with it that's about the death of empathy in our culture. And a lot of people kind of losing that empathic connection with others and really becoming a bit bitter, and we have a culture that is supporting that. So it's understandable that people are going to be like that, but we can choose not to be like that. We can choose to be that kind of shining light wherever we go that's not going to greet people with that level of hostility and unpleasantness being just kind of raining on everybody else's parade or whatever the case might be. Again, in Alex's translation of that, he says, let me rid myself of hostility and uneasy mental states and go happily everywhere. I like this translation of it better, frankly, because the idea is that when we have done that, then we're happy wherever we go. We go happily everywhere. We can be at, the cocktail party where everybody is kind of belligerent and awful and doing their things, and we can still be free of that same mindset. We can not buy into their belligerence and hostility. We can just choose to be there. And once more, through some of the things that were mentioned in the previous verses, we might see that as a teaching or as an opportunity for us to practice seeing them as our dear child, grandchild, what have you. There are all these wonderful tools we have in Buddhism to transform our minds in whatever environment we're in. So going happily everywhere is kind of a nice goal to strive for. A little bit from Geshe Awandargi, his commentary on this verse. He says, if we are angry and aggressive, happiness will always elude us. Happiness and contentment are dependent entirely on our attitudes towards daily situations and life in general. We like to think that they're dependent upon those things happening outside of us, but they're dependent on our own attitudes. This is of course, the big key in Buddhism, right? Is that it's up to us in our own minds to create our experiences. The things are going to be happening around us. We'll be at the cocktail party and everybody will be saying all these horrible things, but that's really up to us as to how we choose to see it. We can be happy and content within that environment if we decide to do so. Continuing on, it says, full of anger, we cannot even enjoy the good fortune of wealth or delicious food. Yet, with peace of mind, we shall be content with the most basic diet and simple dwellings. Again, we can be content with just about any situation. We can learn to be patient and understanding and loving and kind, even in the most dire and awful situations. I was talking over, I have this group of interfaith people. I've been on the interfaith organization here in Santa Fe since the end of 2011, quite some years. And there's a number of us that get together on Tuesday mornings at one of the local coffee houses, and we have meaningful dialogues there about issues that are going on for us spiritually and, what have you. And I brought up the point today that I often make to people when I'm teaching, which is regardless of what's going on in the outside world, I mean, we might look at it now and say, oh, 2025, things are really dire and desperate and awful, da 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 da. And compared to some earlier time when we think they were more idyllic or whatever. But the work is the same. The work is the same whether you're in the idyllic time when everything's wonderful or everything's chaotic and crazy and threatening and horrible. The work is the same. The work is the same of working on our minds, working on deepening our positive qualities, reducing our negative tendencies. So we really have to keep that in mind, is that that's the work to do, not to fix the outside world. Certainly, if there are things you can do to have some positive impact on the world around you, do them. It's needed in our world. Do it with a clear mind, though, not a mind of anger, hostility, what have you. Do it with a heart full of compassion. And that way you'll get much better results from all of that. Even if you don't accomplish the goals, you will have a karma you're creating that is much more positive and wholesome and having a greater impact in a positive way on the people around you. So again, that's the important thing, is that we recognize that the contentment, the happiness is the goal within ourselves, to have that in regard to wherever we're at. And then we'll be content wherever we go. We won't have to, depend upon everything being perfect and exactly how we like it. Alex Burson, in his oral commentary, he states that gradually we learn to have more and more strength so that we are not, to use the Tibetan example, like a dog that when all the other dogs in the neighborhood start to bark, it starts to bark too. I mean, this is the thing, is like that's what happens when we are in those environments with that more hostile mind and not choosing to be at peace and be kind of developing our minds in the midst of those difficult situations. An example of that, he says, would be when somebody we're with starts to complain about the government and all sorts of things. Sound familiar? I don't know when this commentary was given by Alex, quite a few years ago, because I've used it for quite a few years in my teaching on this text. He says, when that happens, we join in and get ourselves all worked up about it. If you can do something, do it. Like I said a few minutes ago, if you can't do anything, well, don't complain. It'll just make you feel worse. This is almost modeled after that verse from Master Shantideva in his 6th chapter, where he says, if it's something that can be remedied, what's the point of worry and stress and anxiety, right? Because remedy it, do what needs to be done to fix it. And the second part of that verse, this is verse 10 from the 6th chapter of Shantideva's text, the chapter on patience. The second part is, if it's something that cannot be remedied, well, what's the use of all the stress and anxiety and worry and hostility or whatever else that manifests that would be a product of that? It doesn't do anything because you can't fix it. You can't remedy it. So we're much wiser to put our energy into, yes, fix the things that we can, tend to those with a positive state of mind. And for those other things that we can't fix, that there is no remedy for, work on our own minds much deeper so that we can accept those things and learn from them and actually use it in our spiritual path and not to create more delusion, more craziness. So back to Geshe Darge, he says a true practitioner of Dharma should be like a bee that is never attracted to just one flower, but flies from one to another. Unlike most people who are fastidious and critical, a spiritual person should have no preferences. Again, we should be content wherever we're at. As he says here, we should be able to adapt to whatever circumstances we find. We don't have that mind that is, needing things to be a particular way for our mind to be at peace. We can be at peace even if things are totally crazy. By remaining in one place too long as well, we make friends as well as enemies, and we become attached to the familiarity of our environment. This is just a second little kind of point he makes on this. Jason Kappa, the great master of the tradition we practice, the Geluk tradition, was called the wanderer because as soon as people heard he was in one place and came to him presenting offerings, he would move on. Like, I don't want to get the attachments and the entanglements that happen when all these behaviors start, where they start seeing you as some great teacher, whatever. This was, of course, the case with Jason Kappa because of his great scholasticism and knowledge and what have you. Tsongkhapa acted in this way until he achieved full realization. Then he remained in one place and, speaking from his own experience, gave discourses, founded monasteries, and performed other beneficial activities. So, again, each of us has to look at that and maybe take away from it what we think is most appropriate to our lives. He's not saying we necessarily all have to become nomadic and just wander all over the world, but we do have to watch how that happens mentally. Like when we do get into situations where day in and day out, we're with the same people, playing the same roles, and things become a little too attached to needing to have that, needing to have this certain environment and comfort level in order for us to feel like we're supported in our practice. There's something about always kind of uprooting and going somewhere else that you never really get that space of comfort that so many of us crave and desire in our lives. Lama Tsongkhapa didn't want to be seduced by that. He wanted to continue his spiritual development, just uprooting himself whenever it got too cushy and nice and people bringing him gifts and all these things. So I don't think we can necessarily all do that. I don't think that's necessarily the advice, but watch our minds. To what degree do we become attached to things needing to be a particular way? That's what really this whole section of this verse is about. If we find that we're too seduced by all of that, well, then that's going to create problems because when that goes away, as it will inevitably, because things always change, well, then we get bent out of shape and we can't deal with it because we needed it to be there. We got too used to it being in a particular way. So these are just some, again, little pearls of wisdom, pearls of advice, gems of advice that we're getting from this text and these other commentators who I like a lot of what they share. I hope you don't mind me sharing other people's commentary, but they give me a chance to talk about them as well. All right, verse number 11. We're going to look at the first two lines on this one as well. Actually, no, I think we're doing the whole verse on this, I think, because this is all about attachment, this other delusion. We've been looking kind of at hostility, anger, things like that, but this is one of the other three poisons. Abandon attachment to all things. That's a pretty big statement. All things. In other words, have no attachment, have none of this clinging to the objects that bring us pleasure and not wanting to be parted from them. And of course, abide then free of desire. Desire here doesn't mean a kind of general desire like we talk about the desire to become a Buddha or something. We mean the desire that is afflicted, the desire that requires all those various things in our lives because we are attached to them. We need them in our lives. He goes on to say, attachment, this root poison, fails to bring even the higher realms, because if we live our lives attached to these things I mentioned in a previous class, the 8 worldly dharmas, I think it was the last class, those are the patterns of attachment that we have. And if you are attached to all of those and to the comforts of this life, you may not even get a good rebirth. We won't get an existence in a human life again for some time because we've wasted this life. And then he goes on to say, in fact, it kills the life of true liberation. true liberation, meaning the higher states that we can attain of liberation from our own samsara, as well as enlightenment. Those things are unattainable if we're driven by attachment. And you can end up wasting this whole life, as many beings do, unfortunately, being just all about attachment to the comforts of this existence. We talked about this again last week with these 8 worldly dharmas, where we crave having material things and not losing them, where we crave having all the comforts and happiness, pleasant experiences, and avoiding what is unpleasant. We crave having a good reputation and avoiding a bad reputation. And then, of course, the praise that we love to hear and avoiding any criticism, anyone pointing out our faults. So this is, again, the patterns of attachment. I don't know that I need to spend a whole lot of time talking about it, because this is such a core teaching that I'm sure we've all encountered in many ways, though attachment is very hard to remove, hard to address. Uh, Alex Berzin, who was a student of Geshe Ngawandarge's, he says that Geshe used to say, life is too short to taste everything. So don't become a professional tourist of samsara. You don't have to taste everything of samsara. That's not going to get you anywhere. A very helpful piece of advice. I mean, when I first read that from Alex, I was thinking about this whole idea of bucket lists, right? A lot of people have bucket lists as they get into their older years, of like maybe even younger years, of like all the things I need to see, I need to do before I die. Well, you know, and if you've done all those things, is you're going to die happier? I mean, I don't know. Maybe some people feel like they will die happier knowing that they saw you know the 7 wonders of the world or whatever, and all these various places, and tasted all these wonderful foods from different countries and whatever. I mean, these are really just transitory experiences. Many of my teachers have said, we've done these things zillions of times in the past, and the variety of existences and worlds that we've lived in, and it's not brought us any real lasting happiness, right? They were transitory, fleeting experiences. This is what attachment, one of the main faults of attachment, is that it doesn't get us what we really desire at a deeper level. It's not bringing the happiness that we seek. It's they use this phrase, it's like drinking salt water to quench our thirst, right? If you've ever done that, it just makes you thirstier, right? And then you grab another glass and you just get thirstier after that, and thirstier and thirstier. That's the tendency with the mind of attachment when we become obsessed with that, is that we never really get satisfied. We buy this thing, and then something better comes along. The new model. I don't know what they're up to with the iPhones now. Is it like 17 or 14, or I don't know. I never bought a single one. I really was kind of resistant to that whole technology of phones, and I eventually got a smartphone, but it's a really cheap model. But this is what our whole culture is built on, right? This craving and desire that corporate corporate businesses are really about filling that need, and they feed that need by creating more and more things that are better and better and smarter and whatever. So be careful, get on that kind of hedonistic treadmill where you're just continually looking for new pleasures, new excitements, new things to do. You know, more content by pulling away from all that and not being so caught up in all of it. So don't become, again, a professional tourist of samsara. We've done it all before, and we don't need to do it again. From a translation of a text by Lama Zopa in some of his teachings, I think this is from The Light of the Path, the Kadampa Geshe Shawaga. And remember, the Kadampas are those who followed Lama Atisha's teachings 1,000 years ago. And he says, the cause of all outer suffering is desire for this life. Therefore, you must renounce the desire of this life. When the desire for achievement in this life is too strong, then your mind is not happy. Again, we see that driven by desire, you're never going to have a contented mind. You're never going to be able to be at peace, because you're continually looking for the next thing. When that happens, then all these 3 happen at once. You get negative karma, there's suffering that ensues, and a bad reputation. Therefore, stop the many various thoughts of desire. Desire only leads to bad results. It doesn't lead to good results. Seeking so many things for the happiness of this life must stop. When you are able to turn away from the desire for this life's happiness, that is the beginning of happiness, meaning true happiness. There's a happiness that comes when we are no longer guided by, led by all of those temporary pleasures and the attachment to them that just keeps craving, grasping at all of those. maybe I'll stop here. We're up to verse 12. I think we'll do okay. We've got 2 more classes. We might have to zip through a few verses when we get there, but we essentially have, yeah, about halfway through the text if we consider, at least halfway through the text, we consider the few verses that we covered at the end in last week's. Got about 5 minutes then, 4 minutes or so. Were there any questions or comments on tonight? Yes, please, Kath.
Hi, Don. How are you?
Hi, Kath. I'm doing well. How about you?
Thank you for your teachings.
You're
I'm
welcome.
just right at the very end there. It said you'd also have a bad reputation. I didn't
Uh,
understand that. How did that come to be?
well, Lama Zopa didn't comment on that, I don't think, when he shared that verse. But the idea is that certainly if you are someone who is a practitioner of this path and you end up, instead of putting all the energy and attention into practicing the path of non-attachment, of trying to reduce the delusions, and you exhibit the behavior of somebody who's just as addicted to samsara and the pleasures of samsara as a being who's never met the teachings, well, then perhaps you'd have a bad reputation that would ensue from that. That's how I took it. That, what we want to do ideally is to not have hypocrisy in our practice, where we are essentially saying, oh, look at me, I'm so wonderful, and I practice the teachings, and I'm, embracing all these things. And then our behavior in our lives is really opposed to that, is really not in
Perfect.
line with that at all. And so then we get a bad reputation from that because, yeah, and again, all of us are not perfect. I mean, I'll freely admit that I'm not perfect in terms of my own patterns of attachment and anger and all these things. I've got my own stuff that I still continue to work on. It's not to say that we should, be worried about the bad reputation part of it, but we should always be dedicated to improving our minds as best as we can continually and doing the additional work that we always need to do, right? To say, okay, I'm going to work on that level of attachment. I'm going to work on this level of anger and hatred. I'm going to work on all these things gradually as best as I can, and not just kind of give it up and continue to follow these patterns that we know from the Buddha's teachings don't lead to anything that's worthwhile. So that's the idea, I think, that is being spoken about there. I may go back to where that was shared. I can't even remember at this point. There's a wonderful set of teachings from the Light of the Path retreat that was put together in a package in what's called the Living in the Path series. Actually, was one of the teachers that got the honor of working on these teachings after Lama Zopa's retreats in North Carolina. We'd have the transcripts of them, and we put little courses together. And I think this course was called The Happiness of Dharma. The idea being that when we begin to see that the Dharma leads to, even in this life, greater states of well being and happiness by the contentment we have when we aren't on that hedonistic treadmill and trying to continually chase all those objects of attachment. And we can, of course, have deeper happiness by practicing the Dharma to an even deeper level. Anyway, I think those teachings, that quote came from those teachings that are in that module of Living in the Path. You can do the Living in the Path series on your own through the online learning center of FPMT. I don't think it's taught in the centers quite as much anymore, but it was a nice little tasty experiential thing based on Lama Zopa's teachings on these various topics. And it's really quite an inspiring one because you come away from it thinking, yeah, I want that happiness. I want the happiness of the Dharma in my life. And all of us have tasted it to some degree. You wouldn't be here if you hadn't tasted it and begun to see some of the benefits of practicing the Buddha's teachings. But yeah, anyway, it's just a little footnote of where that particular quote came from. Let me go back to that and take a look and see if I can find if he did say anything. But that was my understanding. So, anyone else? Thank you for that, Kat. Anyone else? Okay, so let's go ahead and do our dedication prayers. Again, I usually have a couple that I do, and then a prayer for His Holiness, as well as for Lama Zopa's reincarnation to be found and to have everything be auspicious for that. So let's start with this general dedication prayer, dedicating for the result that we were motivated by at the beginning of tonight in generating bodhicitta. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may we quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And this wonderful verse about bodhicitta continuing to grow and develop and to never decline in the least. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow. And may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And again, really want bodhicitta to strengthen in our own minds as well as to be arising in the minds, especially of beings who are causing difficulties and problems in our world, so they can find this perfect mind that will lead to the attainment of their complete well being. Again, we'll do the prayer for His Holiness the Dalai Lama for his good health and long life. He's coming up on his 90th birthday in about a month. So we want to create the conditions for him to continue to be in this world, to have all of his wishes fulfilled. And we can think about the same for all of our other teachers who are still with us in physical form. They may continue to have those results as well. The wish granting, wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then we'll do this prayer for, again, the swift return of Lama Zopa. As I've mentioned before, his reincarnation apparently has happened according to observations from His Holiness. Now there is a team of people that are looking actively for that reincarnation. So we want everything to continue to be very auspicious for his being identified as a reincarnation, and for everything to be perfect for that being, whoever that is, young uh, girl, young boy, to be able to benefit us and all beings in this world. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wear the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request, while striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. And lastly, as usual, we dedicate for whoever it is that we're holding in our hearts. There are beings who we know who are going through difficult times right now, having obstacles to their well-being, or perhaps experiencing illness, or who are dying, or who have died recently. We send that positive energy out to those beings that we, again, are moved by their situation. We think that it removes their suffering immediately and brings them all the causes that will lead to their ultimate well-being. We also make that aspiration that all beings may find complete freedom from their suffering and the true happiness that they seek through what we have done here tonight. Thank you all for joining tonight. I'm enjoying going through this text with all of you. Again, you might work with a few of the verses in here over the next week. Maybe something struck you from tonight in particular that you go, oh yeah, that would be a good one for me to do some extra meditation on and maybe begin to incorporate in my life. However it is that you want to work with these, that would be great. It's the idea behind giving these teachings, is that you can begin to use these pearls, these gems of advice that Lama Atisha has given in your daily life to guide you. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Sheila, for hosting. And I will look forward to seeing you all in a week.